Okay, folks. Look, thank you very much for taking the time out this afternoon for this presentation. Look, I'll be very honest. I've only been in Peru for 2 days. I've spent out of those 2 days, I've spent one full day here. Okay, and I've loved your campus and loved meeting your faculty. It's been fantastic. But look, I really want to start. I've actually started most of my presentations. I just get a bit of a selfie going, and then I tweet you guys. Okay, so what I try to do is I do it at the beginning of the presentation and not at the end, because at the end you're usually looking really tired, and at the beginning at least I can usually get a smile from you. Now I promise the people at the front you won't be disadvantaged. I won't get you any more closer than the people at the back. Okay, but please, if you can do me a favor and smile, I'll get half my head in the photo, and you guys over there, well, you can stay over there, but I'll try and get a little bit of you. Okay, terrific, guys. Ready, steady. Give us a wave. Oops, just give us a wave. Great, terrific. Thank you. Now, if you want to look for that later on, it'll be up here on this Twitter handle. Okay, so yep. And I'll take that as a concession that you've all agreed to it. Okay. Now, what I wanted to talk about today is actually something which I've been thinking about for a while, but it's a little bit rough. Okay, now, if you have a look at my title, I'm an executive dean, right? Now, what an executive dean means is that at some point in my life, I used to be reasonably good at doing research, but now I do administration, right? Which means I don't get to do a lot of research. So some of these ideas that you'll hear today are sort of emerging ideas. They're not necessarily at the pointy end, but there's some of the new ideas that I've had around this sort of theme for a while. But before I go on, it's a pity we have these lights on, but I think it's because they want to take pictures of me, right? But I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. Okay, so just to sort of set the scene, when I actually started out as an academic, I had no interest in sustainability, no interest in climate change, no interest in any of those things. Actually, to do my PhD, I went and sought industry funding, and they gave me industry funding, and I did my work in meatworks. I worked in abattoirs. That's where I did my research. And I did a big study of how do we make successful meat industries. So we compared Australia, the US, Netherlands, and Denmark. And really, the reason why I did that and chose those countries was so that the grant that I had meant that I could go to Europe a couple times a year, and I got to go to the US. So I got to travel around a bit as part of that. And I was reasonably successful as an academic in that area, publishing in sort of our leading management journals, Academy of Management Review, Academy of Management Studies, Journal of Management Studies. So we're totally dark now. Some would say that's the best way to see me. Okay, that's great. Thank you. That's great. That's spot on. Now look, the other thing is, but I didn't want to be known as the meat guy for all my life. So about 20 years ago or more, I thought, oh, okay, I'll have a look at an area that nobody else is really looking much at, and that was sustainability. How do organizations deal with sustainability? And it's a topic, it's a big topic now. You would see articles on it all the time in the press. It's absolutely huge. But 20 years ago, my supervisor said to me, why would you want to do that? Nobody's interested in that. And then, as I got more into sustainability and got into climate change, he said, why would you want to do climate change? Nobody's even heard of that. And in actual fact, some of my first papers that went to some of the top leading American journals, 10, 15 years ago, were rejected based on referee reports that came back and said, is climate change real? And it's sort of really hard to believe that now when you think about it. But back then, it was very, very sort of cutting edge. Now, along the way, I became a professor of sustainability, and I became dean of the UQ Business School, right? And as I got into this exciting stuff around climate change, my motivations for doing the work really changed. My initial motivations for doing work in sustainability and climate was it made me different to other academics, and therefore I could build a career on that. But as you read the stuff on climate change, as you read the IPCC reports, as you look at the increasing data around extreme weather events, you can't not be impacted upon it. And so my motivations changed. And that's why my family would be horrified if they knew that I had this picture up there. Particularly, this is my daughter, Meg. She's 18 now. She'd be really horrified to know that I'm taking this picture of her and showing it to people all around the world. She just would be absolutely, she would go Burko at me, right? Be really angry. Anyway, my motivations have changed. I think that it's my role as an executive dean or a dean and as a researcher to inform as many people about the importance of dealing with climate change and the importance of our organisations and our students hearing about it. So that's what my motivations have changed, from being a pure researcher to, I think, letting people know and let's having informed discussion and debate about this stuff. And so this is just a couple of things that we do. So at one point we got Richard Branson out, and our business school got Richard Branson out to talk about this issue with our students and our business community. We've hosted various workshops with American academics, brought them out to Australia to talk about sustainability. And over here, a really important part of sustainability is not only just the environment part, but here we had groups of our executives working in the equivalent of sort of food labs so that we could provide food for shelters and people in need. And here, as I am in Peru, I've done in India and Indonesia, lots of places given workshops on the same type of topics, which has been really, really well received. And so I put this one up here because there is a nice story. Oh, sorry, I've just been edited. There's a nice story to this one. Okay, now my name is Andrew Griffiths, and I happen to share the same name as these authors. Oh, this author, Andy Griffiths. Now, Andy Griffiths, he writes books for children. Okay. And so the name of his book is The Day My Bum Went Psycho and Bumageddon. So he writes these rather vulgar books to encourage young children to read. Okay, and we share the same. At one point, when I first released my book on the Sustainable Corporation, we shared the same publishing house, Allen and Unwin. And it was at that point that I realized, when I actually got Andy Griffiths' royalty check, that in actual fact, there was a lot more money in writing children's books than there were in writing books about sustainability. Now that must be a local joke because I don't think anybody here got it. But anyway, it's a pretty phenomenal thing. And more recently, my work has shifted to this: how do we create organisations that are climate resilient? How do we create organisations that can adapt to extreme weather events and to climate change? And this has led me on to the current topic. Now, how many of you are aware of these two people? And I'll give them an introduction. If you're aware of Adam Smith, have you heard of Adam Smith? Okay, Adam Smith wrote a treatise called The Wealth of Nations. And in The Wealth of Nations, right, Adam Smith said basically that countries had comparative advantages. Okay, so you think about what it is that Peru has that's a comparative advantage. It probably, at one point, it was probably around gold. At another point now, it's probably around agriculture, mining, maybe seafood. So its comparative advantages over other countries are probably in that area. A country like Australia, it had comparative advantages in cheap production of meat, wheat, gold, minerals. Okay, so different countries had comparative advantages, and that was basically the basic treatise of the Wealth of Nations. Then in the 80s, this guy came along. Now, he may not look familiar to you, but you may have come across his work. Now that's Michael Porter. Now Michael Porter wrote a couple of books, but the one that I'm referring to is he wrote The Competitive Advantage of Nations, right? And in Porter's Competitive Advantage of Nations, he came up with this model. I would draw it here, but I don't have anything to draw on. He came up with this model. It was a Porter's diamond. At the top of the diamond was firm strategy, structure. So the interrelationships between firms and their rivalry was one important component of creating competitive advantage. Down the bottom of the diamond, he had supporting and related industries. So to have competitive rival firms, you needed supporting industries. And then over here, you had demand conditions. So if you had a sophisticated market, you would have sophisticated firms, right? Demand conditions. And over here, factor conditions. And the factor conditions are the very factors that go into your firms in terms of creating competitive advantage. Now, Porter basically said that that diamond creates the basis of how firms create countries, how countries create sustained competitive advantages. Now, that's not controversial in itself. And then he has two elements on the side of that model. One is chance and one is government. And he says these two factors sometimes can influence the competitive advantage of nations. Now, what I'm talking to you about today is a little bit about that model, but I'm talking about it in terms of the competitiveness in terms of a climate changing world. Because one of the very factors that Porter left out of his model was he left out the natural environment. He left out the issue of climate change. And so what I'm speculating, well, I'm not speculating, I sort of indicate, I know that this is happening, is that there are going to be winners and losers in a world that's experiencing climate change. So in a climate changing world, different countries and different sectors of an economy are going to win and going to lose. And I'm going to demonstrate to you why that's the case. So yeah, so basically what I'm saying is that ultimately, using the work of Porter and Diamond, I don't know if you've heard of Diamond, but Jared Diamond wrote a book called Collapse, in which he documented how different nations and civilizations collapsed and the characteristics of those collapse. You combine those two pieces of work together and you start to look at how climate change creates new winners and losers in terms of the national competitive advantage of economies. And what I argue is that in actual fact, there are two things which are going to become really crucial to how we, or how our nations adjust to this. And that's going to be how we create resilience and how we create adaptation. If we can create adaptive institutions and resilient industries, then we are able to help our countries deal with the complexities and difficulties of climate change. I'm going to sort of preface my, my story on two tropical cyclones. Now, I don't know if any of you have tracked the progress of Hurricane Irma. Yeah? Well, the latest figures, and these figures will modify over time. So Irma formed around the 30th of August. It's now, what, the 12th of September. So in 12 days, it's caused roughly $30 billion worth of damage. Now that's extraordinary, that impact. And why I've put these two up here is because they're two tropical cyclones that hit Queensland. Now, on a separate issue, if any of you are interested in coming to study in Brisbane, I just want to point out that Brisbane in Queensland is somewhere down here on the map, and that these tropical cyclones didn't come anywhere near us, okay? So we're reasonably safe. So I just wanted to point that out. But why I've put these up there is Cyclone Larry was about, I think, 2006, and Cyclone Yasi was about 2011 or 12, somewhere around then. And both of them became Category 5 tropical cyclones, so the largest category cyclone that you could get. Now this one, Larry, if you look at it, came through Tropical 5, hit the coast at a Tropical 4, and then sort of dissipated, went inland and washed out. And you think, well, what's that got to do with us? Well, Larry wiped out 90% of Australia's banana production, banana crops. Now, you think about that, 90% of Australia's banana crops, you think, oh, that's just bananas, okay? Don't worry about them, just bananas. The price of bananas overnight went from $2 a kilo to about $14 a kilo. Now, what happened there was that single impact in terms of the increase in the price of those bananas actually increased the price of inflation by 1%. So annual inflation increased by 1% by that one tropical storm wiping out 90% of banana production. Now it's really interesting to think about that and the ramifications through an economy, because bananas don't grow back quickly. Takes them about 9 months to grow, okay, to be able to, before they can fruit again. But that one extreme weather event added a significant burden to the inflation of Australia for that year. Okay. Overall, the economic losses were 1.5 billion for Cyclone Larry, and for Cyclone Yasi, almost 7 years later, it was $2.5 billion. Now, these extreme weather events, they've always occurred, but what we do know is that in a climate changing world, that the severity and the impact of these extreme weather events increases. So we know that the potential increase in economic losses, not to mention the social and the community losses, also increases. Now that's just one form of extreme weather event that's been exacerbated by climate change. The others are things like droughts, high impact rainfall, windstorms. There's a whole range of factors that impact on industry and infrastructure. So overall, right, you look at the inflation on fruit, 24%, vegetables, 18%. It's quite amazing stats, okay, when you start to see how a very narrow storm could impact on a national economy. Okay. So, just to sort of paint the picture about climate change, right, and why this is important. Well, I mean, it's a really pretty picture. Peru's sort of very similar to Australia. It doesn't really stand out too much in this picture. But what this is a picture of is this is a picture of energy consumption. And you can see China, you can see India, Taiwan, Japan. And what it is, it's a picture of this. It's a picture of CO2 emissions being released into the atmosphere. Now, the objective was to try to keep our emissions below 400. But what we know now is that our emissions are actually at 405 parts per million in the atmosphere. Okay? So our emissions profile is actually increasing quite dramatically. What is the impact of that? Well, you may have heard that the goal of the Paris Accord was that we were trying to keep climate change to below a 2-degree temperature rise on average. Well, if we keep on going up the way that we're going, we could hit a temperature rise of 4 degrees Celsius. Now, when you get to that temperature rise of 4 degrees Celsius, and I'll leave these slides with you so you can actually have a look at them in more detail. What you start to get is you start to get really impactful things like this region in here becomes more susceptible to issues to do with drought and extreme weather events. Over here, you find that parts of your agricultural base might move from here to far north Australia because there's more rainfall and less rainfall in traditional arid belts. You find in India, you get substantial increases in heat waves and flooding, and therefore the loss of economic, the loss of crops. And what you get over here is you get substantial warming of parts of the world that are used to cold and frigid temperatures. So much so that in actual fact, in a climate changing world, these parts, which are sort of wastelands, might actually become the new food belts new food belts in terms of food production and agriculture production, because they have warmed up so substantially that before, when we couldn't grow anything there, we now would be able to grow wheat, etc. Now, you know, you think about this, and then you follow it through, and some of the implications are, and what we know is that an increase in the temperature, an increase in drought, creates very, very stressful food conditions in places like Africa, China, and throughout Southeast Asia. And suddenly we start to see that also here in Mexico, less so in terms of the rest of Latin America, but we start to see that some of the impacts of climate change, they impact on food security, they impact on sea level rise. Australia is sort of at risk of sea level rise, particularly along its coastline. That impacts on infrastructure, where your infrastructure is located. You think about your coastline infrastructure, and in many coastal cities in the US and in South America, Latin America, what you find is that coastal cities tend to have their water treatment facilities, their sewage facilities, their ports, their airports, all close to these low-lying lands. And that is fairly significant infrastructure which is at risk of inundation. In actual fact, a study that some colleagues and I did found that a lot of firms in Australia during the 80s and 90s relocated their textile plants over here into Jakarta in Indonesia. Now, the delta part of Jakarta, it now regularly floods. And what seems like a really good decision to relocate your manufacturing plants to a country that had cheap labour and plenty of land now no longer seems so good because of the regular flooding and the impact that this has on logistics. Okay, so you start to see that a climate changing world, this is extreme weather and overall risks, that a climate changing world actually has significant risks. And why I've put this picture up here is because I think it's quite controversial. And the reason why I think it's controversial is that basically this picture says that if you're a country with a reasonable income, that your ability to withstand the impacts of climate change are more than a country which has a lower level of GDP, okay? In other words, you've got more ability to tax, more ability to be able to spread the economic losses around your community because your community is wealthier. But the poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to sort of these types of climate change risks. That's a flood map, okay? So what's the dilemma? The dilemma and the challenge. Okay, you can see that, and I've presented it very, very, I suppose, in a quite a rough and vulgar fashion. But you can see that the impacts of climate change are quite pronounced, and they're quite broad spread. The notion that as nations and as companies, or as firms, if we continue to do what we're doing now, then we are in for a lot of pain, okay, in future generations. So we have some choices ahead of us. And some of those choices are around making our organizations more resilient, But I think, as I'm arguing here, that we actually have to go about making our nations much more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And I only put this one up here because I did get to meet Richard Branson, and he, if you look here, he actually did manage to hold my hand, which was really a bit odd, but so, you know, many of you would know this, that in actual fact now China has surpassed the US in terms of carbon emissions. So I just wanted to ask you, right, when you look at that, you've got China, the US, Europe, Japan, top emitters of carbon. So we know that they actually are having quite a significant impact in terms of climate change. But when you actually change that and you put it in a per capita basis, we actually see that China's not so bad, India's not so bad, Indonesia's not so bad, obviously because they've got such huge populations. But a country like Australia suddenly goes to about 44 kilos of carbon emissions per head, because we're a really small country, you know, 23 million people, but we are very highly we've got a highly carbon intensive economy. And then you see a very similar profile occur for both Canada and the US. Now, the interesting thing about this, when I show my students this, and they go, yeah, but Australia's small, we've got small numbers of people, but you know, China's got lots, and their emissions are the highest. And then you say to them, okay, you say, well, look, and I'll do it here. Who here has bought, okay, so you've got to put your hand up really high. Who here has bought a new phone, a new laptop, or some other type of portable electronic device, and I'll broaden out and I'll say over the last 2 years? And if you haven't bought it, have your parents bought it for you? Somebody bought you something like that. Okay, so it's almost all of you. Now, when I do that in a class in Australia or in the US, similar, you know, you get about 98% of the audience put their hand up. And then you say to them, well, look, what we have done is we have just outsourced our emissions, typically to China, because that's where a lot of these products are manufactured. And we've done it because it's cheap. It's cheaper than having those emissions and those products produced in our own country. So what we did was we actually said, okay, if I'm living here or if I'm living over here, we said we've outsourced that to China, and China's emissions are higher than anybody else's, but we're doing that because we want the cheap goods. So in actual fact, we have to take some responsibility for those emissions. Okay, we have to try to make the connection between our consumerism and China's willingness to deliver products and services to us in return. So, not to depress you anymore, but if you want to look at some of the, I know it says to Habitat to 1990, and we know that there's an acceleration since 1990 to now. Okay, so habitat loss across all our biomes has increased dramatically, and you would see it around here in terms of your own landscape. We've also seen, this is one of my favourite graphs, the capacity through industrial fishing to overfish our stocks of fish. Okay, as this year changes, we've seen in the post-war period our capacity to be able to industrialise fishing. Now, you might be saying, why are you showing us this stuff? Well, I'm showing you this stuff because we have the intersection of two things at work. We have our industrial system, which is coming through, which is making the most of our biomes, in actual fact, in doing so, damaging them. But also, then we have things like this, and on top of that, we're producing a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So we've got stressed natural ecosystems, and onto those stressed natural ecosystems, we're actually adding climate change. We've got two different issues. We've got a development issue, and on top of that, then we're putting a climate change issue. And it creates what I'm saying is, I suppose, a perfect storm by which we face the climate changing advantage of nations. That there will be some winners and losers as the world continues to experience climate change. So this merges back to my, I suppose, my last theme, which is that the need, and this is almost an anti-economic argument, the need to create resilience and slack. Now, there's one thing that that we know in terms of, if you're an organizational theorist, if you're an economist, that in actual fact, slack is not a good thing sometimes because it's a slack resource, it's not being used. It's inefficient. If you're an organizational theorist, the whole notion of org theory and management practice over the last 60 years has been to remove inefficiency. Okay? So when we say that we need to create slack and resilience, we're actually saying that we need to create some form of fat in our economies and in our organizations that provide us with the ability to adjust to this type of changes. In the 2010, this is the latest one I could get in terms of CEOs, 93% of CEOs said that sustainability would be crucial to their business. 72% said it was important in terms of their brand, and 72% saw that education around climate change was crucial. So there's a growing awareness amongst our top CEOs around this issue. So why is this not translating? Why is it not translating into how we act or how our organizations act or how our economies are structured? Now, I don't have any answers to that at this point, okay? But what I do know is that if we keep on going along the way that we're going, that we're already seeing vulnerable industries and vulnerable sectors of the economy. So we know, for instance, that those sectors of the economy that are climate sensitive are the first to feel the impacts of climate change. Climate sensitive industries are things which are dependent on climate inputs, so agriculture. Think of, for instance, the significant issues that are being, challenges that are being faced by the wine industry in Europe. So we have the distinct possibility where winemaking production could shift in a climate changing world across continental Europe towards the UK. You know, whoever would have thought of Yorkshire producing champagne? Okay, it's a really odd thing to think about, but that's the type of shift which is happening. We also know that vulnerable sectors are sectors which are really important to this economy. We know that logistics plays a really important part in Peru and Peru's economy. And so energy, transportation, resource, agriculture, tourism, and financial sectors. You know, what happens if your tourism industry is impacted because of significant extreme weather events, whether they be drought, or whether they be, as recently happened in India, monsoonal rains, which actually stop your ability to run your infrastructure? Okay? So there are quite some significant industries which are impacted. And then we often know that this extreme weather event, it impacts on direct infrastructure like bridges and rails and road, but it also impacts on other factors like the cost of insurance, the cost of reinsurance, okay, which is what companies need, what organizations need, and people need in terms of creating certainty about their investments. So you can see that it starts to impact not only in terms of the direct impacts on agriculture production and those directly climate-related industries, but then it starts to feed through the economy. You know, and then, you know, you're left with this type of image where, you know, this is not too dissimilar to the images that would have come from the last two hurricanes that went through Florida and Texas, where people actually, their infrastructure, their houses were built on low-lying land. There's no way of escaping a storm surge. The water has to go somewhere, okay? So the challenge that I see, right, and I'm going to leave my presentation here because I haven't figured out the answer component to it. But the proposal that I put forward is that when we used to talk about competitive advantage, we used to think about Michael Porter's forces model in terms of national competitive advantage. It made sense. His model made sense. It made sense in a world where we thought the environment was a given good that we didn't have to worry about in terms of figuring out how we created competitive advantage. But in a world in the last 20 and 30 years, which has shown rapid changes, not only in terms of degradation to the environment, but also in terms of climate change, the model that Porter has proposed about what creates competitive advantage for nations, I feel is shifting dramatically. And what we need in terms of our future, and what we need from, bright students like yourself, some of you who aren't asleep, what we need is we actually need to understand how and in your own economies, who are the winners and losers, and how does a country like Peru, like Australia, adjust to a climate changing world. And on that note, I want to thank you for your attention and thank you for coming along tonight or this afternoon. Thank you.